I'm Tina Gross. I am a metadata analyst at the University of Minnesota Libraries. We're segueing now into the panel discussion portion of our event. So we have 7 panelists who are going to be giving 6 brief presentations about different ways that we are striving for social justice in our metadata work at the U of M. I'm going to let the panelists each introduce themselves in turn as they begin their presentation. And then at the end, we will have time for a Q&A from people who are in the physical audience at Anderson Library and the folks who are online. Okay, so I'm gonna try to pick up where the film left off, which was about mid-2006, when there was still this impasse. The Library of Congress had pulled back its initial announced change and hadn't said anything about what was going to happen, what they were going to do. And in fact, that impasse lasted for a little over 5 years. It wasn't until 2021 that LC actually did go ahead and change the subject heading illegal aliens. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because what happened in the interim, I think, is actually maybe the most important part, because in that impasse, when libraries were frustrated about the situation, wondering when the Library of Congress was finally going to act, many places started doing something that had not been done that broadly before, which was to diverge from the official Library of Congress subject headings and make a local change that was more reflective of their values and what they wanted to present to users. And it started off as a trickle. The first couple of libraries that did it were in Colorado. But once it got started, there was really quite a bit of momentum. And by the end, literally hundreds and hundreds of libraries across the United States, from academic to public ones, went ahead and discontinued using the official LCSH illegal aliens and replaced it with a term of their preference locally. And the film actually played a bit of a role in this. So the film came out in 2019, and it was shown around the country. Screenings were hosted by all kinds of local libraries. And it happened to be the case that a local push for changes to the subject heading was often coordinated with a film showing when there were folks who had been following this issue and wanted to try to begin the process of making a local change. Often, one of the things that they would do would be to book a screening of the documentary and have a sort like a panel discussion, not completely unlike this one, to sort of make everyone in their local community aware of the issues and to kind of get everyone on board. And that I really feel that dovetailed incredibly with a broader movement that was already happening in the cataloging and metadata world, that it was part of that movement, and it also helped to propel it considerably. And so by the time the Library of Congress actually made their change, which was November of 2021, we already had this phenomenon of hundreds and hundreds of libraries going through the process of collectively making a decision to make a local change, and also figuring out the technical apparatus by which they were going to do it. So when LC finally made their change, what they changed illegal aliens to was not what the community had been asking for, which was largely to change it to undocumented immigrants, nor was it what they had announced earlier that they were going to change it to, which was a combination of unauthorized immigration and non-citizens. But instead of unauthorized immigration, they changed it to illegal immigration. So that was, it was a victory, unquestionably, but it was not a complete victory in the sense that the I word still remains part of the official heading. And it refers now to actions rather than people, which again is an improvement, but it is not really what we were all hoping for. And so many libraries accepted the change that LC made as not perfect, but good enough. But then there are a substantial number of libraries that decided to continue with whatever original change they had made. And I'm proud to say that the U of M is among those, that that our catalog, instead of saying illegal immigration, says unauthorized immigration. And so we have been able to continue that. But so what I think this broad phenomenon that happened in the wake of these events and of the movie is the profession, I would argue, to a certain extent, but certainly the metadata cataloging part of the library profession, gradually disabusing ourselves of the concept of neutrality and the idea that being neutral is what we aim for, into a more active, and I think you could say even activist approach to inclusion and decency, and just the awareness that descriptions of resources always, always, always convey and embody perspectives. So if something is perceived as neutral, that generally means that it is reflecting sort of the societal default view, which can be okay sometimes, definitely not always. But so I think what our profession has gradually started to come to grips with is that instead of this kind of like passive neutrality that in many cases can be deeply problematic, is that we actually need to be deliberate and conscious about the values and perspectives that our work are transmitting and also adding to. That our profession does actually have values, that we serve all users, that we try not to pass on or add to the marginalization of people who are marginalized in our society, that we want our users to feel respected and valued. And since our profession has those principles, our work needs to deliberately embody them and not just fall back on some kind of passive neutrality idea. And so now we are facing all kinds of new challenges and problems. I think many people may know that the Library of Congress has adopted the name changes to the Gulf of Mexico and Mount Denali that are coming from the executive. That those changes have now been made official in the Library of Congress vocabularies. And so libraries who don't want to use those terms will need to take action if they don't want that to happen in their local catalogs. And I think as a result of this movement and this growing kind of sea change in the profession, there's now a large body of libraries and of professionals working in the field who have experience of making this kind of change, of doing this kind of work. So we have experience of going through the process of deciding to do it and going through the technical challenges of carrying it out. And it also, to a great extent, it has been normalized as something that we do. And I think that that's really the thing that I want to emphasize most, is that there's now a much broader understanding than there has been in the past that making conscious efforts to be inclusive and to not commit microaggressions in our metadata descriptions is not just a sort of side project or a thing that would be nice to do, but that it is absolutely a core and an integral part of our work, and a part of doing the work well. And I think that is going to be well reflected in the rest of the presentations. So I'm gonna stop there and hand it off to Amy, who is next. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Riegelman, and I'm a social sciences librarian here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And I co-chair our systematic review service, and I'm a liaison librarian to several departments, one of which is psychology, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. So in 2021, a librarian from the United Kingdom emailed me just out of the blue, and said that he had some concerns over APA, which is American Psychological Association's Thesaurus for Psychological Index Terms. APA's Thesaurus is what's used for the subject headings in APA databases, like probably the one that has the most name recognition would be PsycInfo. And my peer librarian in the United Kingdom was alarmed specifically at the use of the term Blacks as a racial group subject heading. He thought it was dehumanizing and inappropriate, and wanted to see if there were any coordinated efforts in the US that maybe he just hadn't heard about. And I did some digging and kind of came to the consensus that no, there were no existing efforts to make this change, although we are confident that people had been reaching out to APA like on a one-off level, just not coordinated in order to change the subject or to seek that. So we decided to team up and write an open letter to APA advocating for a change from Blacks to Black people. The heading had been Blacks since 1982, so about 40 years. Prior to that, just like we just heard in Change the Subject documentary with the Library of Congress, prior to Blacks, it was Negroes. And we indicated in our letter that the term Blacks was offensive to many and outdated, and that the subject heading wasn't in alignment with APA's own guidance in resources, such as the APA manual or the APA publication manual, and specifically the 7th edition. In the manual, there is a section called Be Sensitive to Labels, where readers are told to avoid adjectives as nouns to label people. And their listed examples in that section were they were telling readers to avoid saying the gays or the poor. So readers are instructed to use more specific language when referring to demographic groups, such as going as specific as gay men or older adults. So this is the kind of information that we included in this letter, citing the APA manual, as well as other APA guidance documents, like some reporting standards that they have for race, ethnicity, and culture, called JARS-REC. So after drafting this letter, we sought signatures from the librarian and psychology community. Ultimately, we had 435 signatures before we sent it to the APA taxonomist in early 2024. They noted receipt and said they had it on their docket for an upcoming meeting. And then ultimately, we found out that they made the change from Blacks to Black people, and that's now reflected in the Thesaurus of Psychological Index Terms and downstream places such as the PsycInfo database. If you wanted to see the full letter, it's available in our institutional repository, the Conservancy. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Ina, do you have who's next?
Next up is Kristi and Cathy.
Okay, Cathy, I can start and then fill in all the things that I missed. My name is Kristi Bergland, and I am the music metadata librarian at the University of Minnesota. So I do a lot of the back end work with providing metadata for our music resources. And Cathy and I have both worked toward accessibility in libraries and on retrospective data remediation projects. And what we had discovered was that we needed to evaluate and overhaul our accessibility metadata for DVDs and streaming videos. That's what we particularly chose to look at, because we found that there was a fair amount of inconsistency. Cataloging practice has changed over time. In the beginning of DVDs and this new technology, it was kind of an optional, hey, if you have time to uh, add the information about accessibility and captioning and subtitles and all of that, great. But it wasn't a core element. So, depending on the institution's workload and other factors, even metadata created in good faith, we've found just doesn't meet today's needs. Also, in kind of a I don't know, to catalogers anyway, an exciting development, we have more fields within the, the code system that we use. We now have additional fields with which to describe those data elements. So we want to make sure that we can make full use of those additional fields, even for data that was added years ago. So we want to make sure that everything that we have, all of these resources, are described accurately, and that information is also discoverable. And so first we did a small pilot to look at, well, we're wondering just how accurate that is, and took a small group of uh, DVDs from the music library and discovered that we actually had plenty of work to do. Um, we uncovered issues like subtitles and closed captioning are different things, but often records conflated them or didn't contain the information at all. And distinctions like that are important to people who need these features, and our records need to accurately reflect what's available on the resources. So we started with a just trying to get through the stuff in the music library, which was around 2,400 DVDs, and then applied for and were given money from a library's strategic initiatives grant to try to make these updates for materials throughout the university libraries. So we're working on all of our DVDs and some streaming videos as well. And we're finding that, we are looking for alliances with other libraries to kind of leverage our knowledge on cataloging and how this information needs to be accurate with other libraries, so that we can influence some of our vendors who provide cataloging metadata with the product, but may need to be just, kind of brought into the fold with respect to being complete, thorough and accurate with these distinctions, and using accurate language so that these are discoverable. So Cathy, do you want to talk about the process a little bit?
Sure, yeah. We hired students with our grant money. We've hired 9 students total for the project now, plus the regular student that I have for the department. We've had working on it some. And these students are working in Walter Library, and they are basically data collecting for us from the DVDs. In order to see if something's closed captioning or subtitled, you have to actually play the DVD to see if some of those context cues for closed captioning are there or not, and which languages that are there and things like that. So they are currently, we're on our second year and our second grant. And we're about 80% done now. So we're on track to finish in June, getting through the entire DVD collection, which is around 9,000. We've already finished the music DVDs. And then once we are done with data collection, we'll have a whole new process for Kristi and I to figure out. And that'll be a whole new can of worms, I guess. But for now, the students are working very hard, and it's mostly, like I said, data collection. And then for streaming videos, we are going collection by collection. And we simply are doing copy cataloging very slowly on each collection, one at a time. So those might take a little longer, but I do have my regular student worker is working on that. She is a lead student for the project. So she's the one working on streaming video by herself. And then of course I work on some as well. And I think that's about it. Do you have anything to add, Kristi?
I would add that sort of our larger process is, first we did the pilot, discovered that we had quite a bit of work to do. Then, as Cathy described, we're having the students go through and have eyes on the materials. Then we're, running some fixes and doing some patch up with that, and we'll probably be involving Tina, who
Yes.
does the magic in that department. And then we'll be sharing our records that we have remediated back out to OCLC so that the larger community benefits from that. And the other thing we will be sharing is our workflow and our process through different discussions we've had with other institutions, presenting about this. There's been a lot of interest in how we're doing this work. So we want to be sure that we are, helping other institutions do this work as well.
Okay, next up is Lara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lara Friedman-Shedlov, and my role in the libraries is as digital records archivist for the library's Archives and Special Collections Department, which is housed, if you are in person in Anderson Library, it's mainly housed in that building. So my main responsibilities are working with archival materials that come to us as some kind of a digital file. I've been at the University of Minnesota Libraries for almost 23 years, and one of my other big areas of interest is in archival description. In other words, how we describe our archival materials so that people can find them and understand their content. Now, archival material is a little bit different from published material like books and articles or even DVDs. It's not edited and published purposely for public dissemination. It's personal papers or organizational records and can consist of thousands of documents or files in various kinds of formats, including textual documents, photographs, videos, audio files, you name it. Because an archival collection can be extremely large and heterogeneous, we describe it in some different ways from what you typically see for traditional library materials, such as books or journals or articles. Instead of a single catalog record, we use longer records that we call finding aid. The finding aid typically includes things like biographical or historical background on the individual or organization that created the records, and a narrative description, anywhere from a paragraph to a page or so, that gives an overview of what the material is about. We also usually include some kind of listing of the files, usually by folder. And we do also have subject headings, but they are just one small piece of a description puzzle for archives. That said, since subject headings are standardized across all types of material in the library's collections, they are pretty important for archival collections, even if they don't tell the whole story. In the Archives and Special Collections Department, we've been working on a number of ways that we can improve our description in all parts of the finding aid, including the subject headings. We refer to this work as reparative description. And one of the first major things we did back in 2019 is to write a statement of values and principles to guide this work. Now, one of the challenges that we have in archives and special collections is that since a lot of our material is historical, it sometimes will use outdated terminology that, even if it wasn't then, is now considered harmful or offensive. We don't want to change historical material. However, we do want to provide some context for our current users. So one of the things we do in our work in this area is to make a careful distinction between language that is original to the documents and language that we as librarians or archivists apply to describe the material, including the subject headings. So one of the other things we've done is create some notices that we use in our finding aids and also in the online repositories like UMedia. You may be familiar with UMedia, where you find digitized versions of many of these materials to try to provide some of this context. As a department, we've also been working hard to look at the subject headings that have been used for our archival collections and to update them, either with additional or better terms from the Library of Congress subject headings, or sometimes, as Tina was saying, with terms from other sets of standard subject headings that have better terms for some topics in our materials. My colleague Aiden Bettine, who's going to be speaking next, I think will be sharing one example. Now, if you want to get an overview of some of the work that we've been doing in archives and special collections, feel free to take a look at a LibGuide that we put together. I'll put the link in the chat, and I'm not sure if that can be shared out in a way that everyone can see it. But we do have this LibGuide. It lists some of the resources that we've used to guide our work, and some of the resources we've created for ourselves, and some reports on reparative description projects that we've done. So I'll let Aiden take over from here.
Hello, I'm the in-person panelist. If I Zoomed, I'd be 3 doors over. So I figured I'd join in person. But Lara gave a nice setup. Thank you for kind of why and how subject headings are both like utilized and just kind of a different beast in archives, because it's not ultimately our main mode of description, but is certainly a crucial part of a finding aid. So along some of the reparative description work we've done, one effort is our subject sprint, which we've now done twice, which is incredible, where we've worked to specifically edit the archive space subject headings by removing old terms, clarifying terms, cleaning things up, and adding to our archive space kind of lexicon. One of the things about archive space for archivists is that we have to import all the subject headings we're going to use, kind of regardless of where they come from. And so I think that creates some larger issues between just migrations and also like laziness and oversight on the part of archivists. Like, admittedly, like it's easier to grab a term that's there than to click through a bunch of other menus and add a brand new term while you're in the middle of writing a finding aid. Whoa, cool. I'm double screen. And so for a collection, I didn't introduce myself, I guess. I'm Aiden Bettine. I'm the curator of the Treader Collection and GLBT Studies here in the Anderson Library. So all of the collections that I deal with are queer and trans, and that is really crucial for how we describe things. I was checking some stats while my co-panelists were talking. The Library of Congress did not include the word transgender until 2007, sorry. Transsexual was the earlier term in 2006, but it was only established then. And as a trans person, if the terms were added to Library of Congress in my lifetime, around the time that I came out, it's clearly already too late. And it makes me think about a few things that I think are worth mentioning, although obviously many librarians in the room, and I'll talk more about the specific work for Treader, but I think like between the Change the Subject documentary and our work, like something that's really important to say is like our work is inherently political. And I know we all feel that now more than perhaps recently in our careers. And I think like it's so off-putting to recognize who has the power of the language that we're enabled to use and afforded in our field, and that it does come from this congressional governmental power, and that it becomes a political issue. I, for one, have been monitoring is an overstatement, but periodically checking and curious at the point if an executive order says that trans people don't exist federally, when do those terms get removed from the Library of Congress in terms of discoverability, right? Like if we are literally removing websites, stripping language, taking trans people out of things like the website for the Stonewall Monument in New York, when does it come to our library information, and when do people just go, our politicians go, we're going to wipe this out completely? And that's like paired with the reality that Library of Congress is already like not a robust form of description for LGBTQ folks and our materials and our collections, right? I think the list related to transgender people, I'm going to pick on that one because I always do. I have for years, but I think the list in Library of Congress of like related terms is only about 8 or 10 long. And I didn't check how long it is in Homosaurus, which I'll talk about, but it's much longer than that. There's more nuance to like who trans people are, how they show up at work, what type of work they do in the community, what are trans issues that can be utilized as subject headings for describing collections material and our library-based content. So through the subject sprint in our department over the last 2 years, we've actually added 655 Homosaurus vocabulary terms to archive space here for the University of Minnesota. And that does affect all collections and campuses using archive space. So that includes Duluth and Morris and Crookston and Rochester and everybody, not just the Twin Cities, which I think is great. Those 655 terms, it doesn't mean that they're all applied yet to collections, but they're there and available. And that's out of a selection of terms from Homosaurus. So to give you a little bit of context for Homosaurus, I suppose, it is an LGBTQ linked data vocabulary providing a different set of language that is inherently more queer inclusive, that is managed and controlled by LGBTQ people themselves, many of whom are library and information science professionals who serve on the board or volunteer with the effort. And unlike Library of Congress that defined trans people in 2006 and 7, Homosaurus has actually been around since 1997. So it shows the work could have been going on for a while, and certainly earlier than the 90s. There were different iterations by LGBTQ librarians, like through the ALA Social Responsibilities Task Force in the 70s and 80s to create more inclusive terms. So this is something that like queer and trans librarians have been doing literally for all of our careers, is how do we make language more inclusive? How do we make description more inclusive? And how do we make the materials related to our community, therefore more discoverable, paired with the other side, which is to like depathologize and medicalize LGBTQ lives. I can't find the information. We can blame Library of Congress for a second on this. Sorry, I know it's being recorded. I don't mind. But like there used to be a legacy of the trans term in Library of Congress being pathologized and under a psychological-based identity link. And that was removed at some point, I think in 2019, when the term was updated. And now there's also just not kind of a record of that harm in the book. It just says, you know, in the database, it just says revised 2019, but it doesn't specifically say, without going deeper than what you can see kind of easily, what changed and how, and that kind of depathologization happened at that time and why, which I think was a lot of community advocacy. I, for one, would make a room like this fill out a request to change the term every time I presented about like trans oral history work or any of the work I was doing in the teens, so that people could submit with and make more pressure. Nothing to the scale of the Dartmouth crew, obviously. But there's kind of no understanding of like, why did they change the term at that exact moment? And then I think it also erases some of that history of the institutional violence towards trans people by not kind of documenting, here's why we made those choices, and making it at least very public in the Thesaurus search for context. I think in terms of Homosaurus and the Treader collection, and thinking about archives more generally, or this archives more generally, what I love about it is equipping archive space with the Homosaurus terms that I think are most applicable to our collections, not only provide more specificity and nuance, and sometimes allow, I think, me as an archivist to say things that I know that maybe aren't in the materials themselves, right? That could be through donor relations and understanding the depths of someone's identity. That could be like, oh, in the 1970s, we weren't using this terminology, but I understand how the terminology has changed. I should also use the kind of contemporary language to reflect backwards. So if people are doing research on trans people, but I actually have cross-dressing content from the 1960s, that was a huge conflation in the community and in the material. And so I still want to be able to put that trans tag or subject heading in archive space on any of my cross-dressing related materials to draw researchers that way if they want to know what trans life was like in trans publishing in the 1960s and 70s, right? So that's stuff that wouldn't have come through the material on its own, but I can apply that backwards. One of the other things I'll also love, this is just my support of Homosaurus spiel, but is they also include so many forms of intersectionality and nuance within the community. There's more racialized and ethnicity-based terms paired with LGBTQ identities. And I know for some of the donors to Treader specifically and folks I've interacted with, like how important it is to have the fullness of yourself represented in your record or in your organization, something like the Minnesota Men of Color records that served predominantly South Asian and Indigenous men of color and their communities during the AIDS epidemic here in Minnesota from 98 to 2003. And so if you just hear Minnesota Men of Color, you might make assumptions about what that organization is, who it's a part of, and being able to add those subject headings beyond how the organization describes itself, I think provides deeper representation, which is crucial. I think maybe the last note I'm going to leave on for now is just that applying and adding terms, Homosaurus terms to something like archive space, is always going to be initiated internally by a department, by archive staff. I'm thankful that our library catalog was already using Homosaurus terms when I arrived in 2022. And even as catalogers have shifted, everybody is still happy to use Homosaurus and engage it, particularly around the Treader collection. But what I think matters as a queer trans archivist is that, yes, we should actually use Homosaurus for the queer trans archive, right? That's unquestionable. That's the work that has to happen. But the work that we've done, Lara and I and our department, to add this for everyone's use means that queer collections in other archival units are also going to be better described, right? Like it's a net good to my whole department, to the other campuses, other archives on other campuses, that everybody can describe their collections. Because I do believe all collections have the potential to have queer material that maybe just hasn't been found yet or properly labeled or something if they don't already have kind of blatantly LGBTQ related material. And so I think that's a really crucial affordance, especially to colleagues who maybe don't have the same cultural awareness or personal experience that I do in the community to provide those terms. I also just want to shout out, Homosaurus includes things like anti-racist, which Library of Congress does not. So I think there's also some terms that don't even specifically apply to the LGBTQ community or strictly or singularly apply to the LGBTQ community, but that become critical for how we're describing our material for many different kinds of people, but then it's pulled from Homosaurus instead of Library of Congress. So I'll stop there with my comments.
I just wanted to jump back in
Natalie is next.
Oh, I just wanted to jump back in really quick to clarify one thing. Aiden mentioned several times archive space, and I talked about finding aids, but I'll just add that archive space is like is where all the finding aids live. So when you're searching or looking at our archival finding aids, that is the name of the database essentially, where they all live. So and it kind of has its own interface to it and its own set of subject headings. So that's kind of what he was referring to about we upload all these subject headings to it.
All right, gonna round it out. I am Natalie Holmes, and I am the cataloging librarian at the University of Minnesota Duluth Library, coming up on about 2 years here. And at the Duluth Library, I catalog all materials across our collections. And I'm really passionate about social justice work and librarianship, but it can be intimidating, I think, as a new professional in any field, when you feel like you want your work to make a difference, especially when you're faced with so many systems that we rely on that were fundamentally built around a colonialist worldview. So I want to thank you for everyone who's attending for your curiosity about this work. And I'm really honored to be included on this panel and share basically about one place where I saw a problem and was able to help make a change. Get over that feeling of like, where do I start in terms of social justice work? Because it's overwhelming. Today I'll be sharing about cataloging for the Sámi collection at UMD. So I want to start by stating that I do not have personal ties to the Sámi community, and I'm still very much growing my understanding of how to best describe Sámi materials through a culturally conscious lens. So seek other resources if you are interested in this topic. So for anyone unfamiliar, a little bit of background, the Sámi are the indigenous people of Sápmi, which includes northern parts of Finland, Sweden, Norway, and the Russian Kola Peninsula. And through a long, complicated history of politics and border issues in each of these countries, the Sámi people were basically pushed farther and farther north as the government saw fit, and their culture threatened through forced assimilation, like the Norwegianization policy. So it's really important how these works are described about this community. For context of what I'm sharing today, and for any folks who have heard certain terms and aren't aware of their baggage, I will share that the Sámi people are sometimes referred to as Laplanders, Laps, or reduced solely to reindeer herders. These are problematic and harmful terms imposed by governments and not utilized by the Sámi community to describe themselves at large. So to lead this home to the Sámi Cultural Center of North America and many descendants of Sámi immigrants. So the Sámi collection here at UMD has a really long history. It began with former library director Rudy Johnson, who was an important figure in a 90s cultural movement called the Sámi Reawakening that was about reclaiming Sámi identity in the US. And so when I started here, I inherited basically a really large donation to the Sámi collection. It was mostly in Swedish, Norwegian, and Finnish, and it needed to be cataloged so that it could be added to the collection. But because of the rarity of these materials, catalog records can be pretty sparse or non-existent. So this is really research-heavy, labor-intensive work to first make sure I understand the materials in a language I'm unfamiliar with and about a culture I don't belong to, and then translate that back into quality description and subjects so they can be found by users in the catalog. So there's a lot going on. And through this cataloging, one of the more common call numbers, or basically the physical location on the shelves, these materials ended up in was the DLs, which in the Library of Congress classification system is history of Scandinavia. And then it's sorted by country, ethnography, and individual ethnic group by Cutter. And in classification, Cutters are basically a way to further sort materials within a subject. So it's a letter and numbers to be able to alphabetize. And it's either like an author's name, a title, geographic designation, or in this case, a group of people. And what I kept encountering was basically variations of L3 for laps. And as I shared before, in speaking directly with Sámi folks in the UMD community, I came to learn this was not an appropriate term. And on further investigation, I actually found that some of the Cutters and subject headings have already been replaced with Sámi, while others have not, and found out that unfortunately there is no control F for the LC database. So sometimes terms can get missed or never addressed. So once I became aware of the problem, I began researching how to propose a change to LC. The idea felt intimidating, especially when dealing with flawed systems like LC. It means that you are regularly encountering so many problems that you could never hope to address all yourself. But I feel like that's all the more reason to pick one and start the work. So especially with how rare Sámi materials are, I feel like I have this unique exposure with our collection to be able to notice and address this particular issue, both in our library and systemically for other libraries to benefit from. So in working with colleagues in the Twin Cities, we were able to submit a pretty straightforward proposal last September to replace L3 as a Cutter through the Subject Authority Cooperative Program, SACO. And librarians have done a lot of work, especially recently, to make processes like submitting these proposals more transparent and available to all librarians, because it's really different people encountering these words based on their collections, based on what makes sense for them locally. So it's nice that the work can come from anybody. But this is still the government, so it's generally a really slow process of many months. But so far, it has been reviewed by SACO members. It has been put forward for public feedback, and now it is approved. So we are basically just waiting for them to actually implement the change in the Library of Congress classification system. So I find this project to be an interesting example for social justice work, because in some ways this kind of was essentially a clerical oversight. Other areas of LC and subject headings were already recognizing Sámi as the appropriate group term, even though problematic terms are definitely still in use outside of cataloging. But this project was still absolutely worth pursuing. And when the alternative is potential harm, encountering a racist term within the catalog, like, we're compelled to do something. And some of this work really is just kind of chipping away at a large system while addressing things locally as much as we can. I don't want to talk forever, but there's still like a ton of work to do in this area, and I'm really excited to do more, particularly with the Sámi materials. The idea of describing place names, imposed government names tend to always win out over Indigenous geographic names and subject headings. So yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this work. That's what I got.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. So I think we have time for questions. So I think I'm gonna just hand it over to Paul to facilitate the Q&A in the room, and then we'll see. So if people have questions, if online participants have questions that you would like to ask, go ahead and post them in the Q&A function.
Yes. So if you can post in the Q&A in the room, I'm going to go around in just a second to pick up index cards if you have questions. But as we're doing that, I'll just ask if any of the panelists want to make quick comments on each other's projects.
I'll just say that the libraries is a big place, and it's always fun to hear about all these projects and that you don't necessarily know, even though we all theoretically work together. I mean, we do work together, but we don't always know about these cool things that are going on. So it was really great to hear about it. I was really fascinated to hear about the Sámi work that's being done.
I can get us started with a question from the audience in the room. So many of you shared work that started with, I saw something, I'm going to do something. How do all of us build this mindset, one of active engagement?
I will say a little something to start with, which is that's part of what we were hoping to, the ethos that we were hoping to convey when we put together the statement of values and principles that I mentioned. That was kind of an early part of our work, was to say you are empowered to do this. You don't have to send it up the chain. You don't have to get approval and make it a big hairy deal. Just do something. And we've tried really hard as we've been working on various, what you'll see if you do go to that LibGuide that I mentioned earlier is like reports on various little projects, and they're all just small things. And we're just chipping away. And the idea is that this is everybody's everyday work. And just as you have an opportunity to just do something, even though we would love it if we could do something more systematic and thorough and big, and it's not necessarily realistic. So
Yeah, I think I want to share also that I think the documentary is such a great example of, a group coming together and really making their voices heard. But I think a lot of this work can just be a person recognizing what they can do within their power. And sometimes you have more than you expect. And it's really just about like time and willingness and getting your support system, the people you work with, to get on board with it. And most of the time people are really receptive. If you're willing to put in the work, I think people are willing to respond to it.
I think I'll also add, like, much to Natalie's thought, I was thinking about, like, we all have a certain amount of power in our roles and in our daily lives. And I think, like, we're at a library space that actually lets us utilize it. So we should. And I think, like, the organization of information is not neutral. And it's so easy to take that, I don't know, push that thought out of our head and think about our daily work and kind of go on with our routines and our days and like not question why is this listed this way or why don't I have a better term for this, right? And I think, oh, Sandy Berman got mentioned in the documentary, and that man is 90. He's about to turn 91 in October. If you're part of the Sandy Berman fan club, I have a zine for you. Let me know. But he has demonstrated, I think, as like a white, cis, hetero, I'm assuming, knowing that he was married and has children, person and librarian, like he has just like made his whole career to annoy the Library of Congress and into his retirement. And I think I question a lot what is the thing that I want to like spend my life on, like Sandy? And how is that such a good model of like this is professional, but it's activism? And one of the reasons I know maybe some of his work in depth beyond, I think like there's certain librarians who become fans of his work is that he still sends mail to the Treasure Collection, copying us anytime that he finds relevant clippings or articles related to LGBTQ terms, always evidencing literary warrant for the Library of Congress of why a term should be changed or added, and includes copies of what he corresponds with Library of Congress to and his scorecards that he keeps. So like this is a dedicated daily practice by Sanford Berman. And it's amazing to see that like somebody who didn't have, even if not everybody, I don't know, agrees with his actions or like, I know people who find him annoying or incessant or other things like that. What amazes me is he does not have to do this, right? Like he doesn't have to spend the time, but he really has utilized like his professional skills lifelong through retirement and done that advocacy. And I think, I think about someone who's like the head of cataloging for the Hennepin County Library. Was he the head? He was in cataloging. Won't fact check that. He was in the cataloging department, but I think he was the head because he helped institute an entire different subject heading protocol right here. And I think that's a question that I keep raising with something like Homosaurus and adding that to archive space to pull it back for Treader. It's just like, when can we make a concerted effort to make different choices with our power that aren't like the institutional trends, that aren't just like, oh, let's fall into what we've always done, which is listen to the Library of Congress, right? And employ their terms. How do we both challenge them? But I think Homosaurus is such a great example of how do we negate it and build something ourselves, which I think queer and trans librarians and archivists have done forever in our profession. And Homosaurus is such a great example of like, I'm sure it's on people's CVs. I'm sure they've gotten professional development credit for that in their reviews. I'm sure that it's like volunteer in service to the field to serve on the board or to volunteer and update the thesaurus. So it's like, that raises the other question in terms of power is like, how do we make the things, since it's performance review season, right, that we're reviewed about, how do we make those different forms of like activism and advocacy that still give us those academic credentials that we want, right? Publish an article about why the subject headings are not useful, that you're taking a problem with or whatever else, right? So I think it's also thinking about how do we do the work enfolded into our job duties and not see it as something that's like extracurricular or separate or volunteer outside of the 9 to 5 or whatnot.
Any other comments or questions before we move on?
I would maybe just add, in addition to what Aiden was saying, our work is also not static, which is one of the things that I find really empowering. That, you know, uh, in one way of looking at it, our work is never done, but there's nothing in a record or a description that can't be improved and expanded on when we collectively come up with better vocabulary for that. And that's something that, we come across in our work every day. And I find that, both empowering and I guess comforting, that I know that even if I've missed something, or even if, we weren't following a certain practice, we can go back and bring things up to speed, and, just really dynamically improve everyone's experience with a really, very efficient way to do that. And I think that's exciting.
Go for it, Amy. Oh, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So this isn't like profound or, different from what others have said, but it reminds me of, I call it the curse of noticing in my house. Like somehow I'm the only one who sees the dishes building up in the sink. And I think a lot of librarians have that. And I wonder, I don't know if I did a survey, if other people would feel that too, the curse of noticing. And then I think there's a lot of people driven to take collective action, and what Kristi was saying, like not satisfied with the status quo, seeing opportunities for progress. So yeah, a lot of, hey, I noticed that thing, and what are we going to do about that? We, not necessarily one person, although Sanford Berman has done a lot of great things solo probably and collectively.
We can just do a mic. Do you want to just ask your question on a mic?
Repeat it. I'm sorry. I should have
Yeah. We got a question in the audience.
So my name is Rebecca, and I'm the community engagement lead at Mapping Prejudice. So I say that because I am not a librarian. So all of the inner workings that you all do is like on another planet a little bit for me. So my question is, when you decide that we are going to change headings or language at a local level, kind of like, okay, forget Library of Congress, we're going to make the change here. Kind of a twofold question. Does it create a momentum that it bubbles up to Library of Congress? And the other question that I have is, how does, say, Minnesota system then work with, I don't know, New Hampshire's system or Georgia's system if everybody is creating their own nomenclature? And maybe that's a really complex answer that needs to be given, but I'm just thinking of like, how do you then, or is there an underground group that determines what that catalog term is, and everybody agrees across the United States to use that same term, so that when someone looks for something, they're not just stuck in one state? Does that make sense, my question? Okay, thank you.
Well, I can start trying to answer. I'm sure there will be lots of other things to fill in. So I mean, what you described, sort of like agreeing on one term, I mean, that's sort of the essence of what a controlled vocabulary is meant to be. And so a lot of, when there's a problematic term in LCSH, there's a number of approaches that can be taken. I mean, and one is to apply other alternative vocabularies, because there's all kinds of different controlled vocabulary systems that are domain specific. And Homosaurus being an excellent example of those. So one way to help ameliorate a situation like that is simply to apply other terms in your catalog in addition to LCSH. And that happens all the time, all over the place. Lots of libraries are doing that work. When it's sort of a different additional problem when the LCSH term isn't just inadequate, but it's actively offensive, like when its presence at all is a problem, then there's a bunch of additional kind of technical issues that have to be solved. And while there's not sort of a shadow LCSH where everyone agrees on what the replacement terms are going to be, I would say there is a fair level of coordination among the libraries. So to give just a small example, I mentioned earlier in my my part of the presentation that the Library of Congress has adopted the changes to the Gulf of Mexico and Mont Denali, and those are now officially part of their vocabularies. So there's a body within ALA called the Subject Analysis Committee, which is essentially like meant to be a body of people with expertise about subject analysis and controlled vocabulary. So they're starting a working group with participants from around the country that are going to be coordinating and sharing. So many libraries agree. I mean, and I would say, like, this isn't official at the U of M, but we're in the process of working on it, of what the procedure, like what we're actually going to do about the Gulf of America and Mount McKinley, so that individual libraries, when they come up with a technical solution within the system that they happen to be using, and the U of M uses Alma and Prima, which are products of this company called Ex Libris, so that when we've figured out how we're going to handle it, we can actually document the process that we used and share it with other libraries who may be using the same system, who can then copy it or adopt it. And so like that level of coordination, I think is developing and becoming more common. And I guess the other thing that I will throw in, I mean, and I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of panel discussions after this movie, and so if you've ever heard me do that before, you may have already heard me say this, because it's a thing that I think is really important. Is that I think it's really critical that the efforts to make local deviations, or to use something other than LCSH, or to exercise the autonomy of a local library, to not just like just do what LC does, like that should not ever be counterposed with efforts to get LC to change what they're doing and to make improvements. That both of those things are incredibly important, and they're not like in opposition to each other, because there are many small libraries, especially public libraries, that don't really have the ability, don't have the staff. Their systems are less arcane and intricate than the ones that are used by large academic libraries. So they may not have the literal ability to make a local change when they want to. So I think we have to always keep working on both tracks. In exercising our autonomy, and also continuing to keep up the pressure on LC, to make sure that they're always hearing from us and getting feedback. And then to go back to what the initial part of your question, is I see a lot of evidence that LC is definitely aware of the cases where there's broad consensus that something that they're doing is problematic, and they definitely pay attention. And I think a lot of the projects that they have to improve their own vocabularies, which there are many such things that are ongoing that we could talk about. A lot of that comes from the feedback and the sort of complaints that they get, and what the activity, like things that they hear about happening on the ground. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Can ask a question from the Q&A box, and then I can grab any more index cards as well if people in the room have additional questions. This one is directed to Aiden. So Aiden touched on specificity and intersectionality, and I wonder about the use or not of 2S for two-spirit, as is common practice in many contexts in so-called Canada as part of the LGBTQ acronym.
That's a really specific and wonderful question. I'm like, look, my brain is trying to scan the Homosaurus vocabulary list that I stare at too much. So I think that hasn't been a US based switch, but I recognize that Treader, as a collection in Minnesota, we have some of the most robust, like United States based Two-Spirit related collections and archives. So I've thought about that very heavily beyond the hyphened spell out the word, the number 2 hyphen spirit, which is the kind of main designation through Homosaurus. I think the larger, I want to say the only place that I see that happen in a subject heading with Homosaurus is specifically just the larger acronym for the community. So Homosaurus defaults to that 2S LGBTQIA plus. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me, is there a longer version for the community designation. And I think like one of the problems that something like that poses for Treader is all of our collections fall under that broader designation. So I'm not going to put that subject heading on every single, like there's some redundancy there. But this is a great question about how else that shows up, because I don't think, and I've never seen it activated in a way that it's just the 2S by itself for Two-Spirit, but that's linked in the broader community. Treader has different issues with just kind of our historical naming as a GLBT collection. And so I'm continually thinking about, not just in subject headings, but in pamphlets, brochures, on the website, etc., social media. How are we always using language that is different than GLBT? The only time I use that is when I actually say the formal name of the collection. So I think this is a great question that I probably also have to do some more thinking about beyond the specific Homosaurus terms. So thank you.
Another question from the live audience. So many of the panelists spoke about passive neutrality versus deliberate conscious upholding of values. We also mentioned a value of inclusivity. What are other core library values that maybe inform this work?
One of them I would say is transparency. We want, especially, this is something we've thought a lot about in the context of archives. As we've done some of this reparative work that we've been talking about, we've tried to document publicly the fact, the types of changes that we're making in many cases, and be upfront about the fact that this is happening and that it will continue to happen. And Kristi talked about iterative work, it's never done. So we expect that to continue, but transparency is definitely one that we're working on.
I think I'll also add the values related to access and intellectual freedom. A lot of this work can feel kind of, I don't know what the word is, small behind the scenes. Who's even seeing this? I talked about changing L3 to S3. Like, does someone even looking at that know what that means? But I think all of these are ways that material is found in a catalog. It's improving access. It's making sure that people that want to read about these subjects, that want to access diverse perspectives, are able to find them using the terms that make sense to them.
I think I'd jump on that to say, like, it's also about like access of specificity, right? Like if you have a research project or you're learning, whether it's about yourself and it's personal and you're trying to find queer books, or you're doing a research paper or whatever, it's like you really want a journal article or a book or an archival collection that is like at the intersection of, like, I don't know, I could say a number of things. I'm like, multiple identities, maybe a historical occurrence, etc. Like a library should be able to provide that to you, right? That's the goal. Not that you always get this general, here's everything on gay bears, right? Maybe I want specifically, we've got that, but maybe I want specifically something about bears during the HIV crisis, right? Like, and so I think subject headings and having really explicit, specific terms are so critical for that access piece, right? Because it's not just like, do I want to see gay books broadly, right? The odds are you want to see something more specifically at some other intersections of topics or personal interests or research. So I think that's so crucial, especially around subject headings.
I can mention one maybe from my perspective. I'm not a cataloger or an archivist. However, the work I do is around student engagement and outreach. So I know a lot of our archives are very community archive oriented. They're meant to be engaged with, coming from, working within communities whose materials we're collecting. And so for me, the value that underlies a lot of the work I do is co-creating with students, and really not just like trying to think of ways to draw students into the libraries and the work that we do, but really going to them, talking to them, figuring out what they need and want from the libraries that may actually surprise us, so that we transform the kinds of things that we do in the libraries in the first place. I'll ask another question from the Q&A. Is there any sort of middle track within what Tina's describing for larger institutions to assist smaller ones in making independent changes if they don't want to just fall in line with LC but don't have the capacity to do that on their own?
I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything that is exactly what you seem to be um, hinting at, but I think that the working group that I mentioned, that is a working group of the subject analysis committee, does intend to attempt to coordinate that sort of thing to the extent possible. I mean, I think the limitation is that even at the largest institutions, the staff don't really have time or freedom to just go out and spend their work hours volunteering at other institutions for the most part. Although, I mean, if there was a appetite for that among administrators, I think that would be amazing. But a thing that I will throw in that I think is relevant, especially for smaller institutions, is that vendors, the companies that run and own the systems that library use, are for the most part quite responsive and on board with these kinds of efforts, and many of them have shown a lot of eagerness to offer services and the ability for libraries to have more choices about what they're doing. And so that's actually another goal that that the SAC working group has, is to reach out to vendors and find out from them what kind of initiatives they have, and like if they are not currently offering like the capacity for a subject heading replacement in a given smaller like ILS system, what do they need to make that happen, and is there some way that this group can help facilitate that? Because I mean, it's true, like I tend to think, when I think about like the efforts that I've been involved in to help smaller libraries, it's mainly been focused on putting pressure on LC and getting them to change their things, which is incredibly important. But we also don't want smaller libraries to just have to wait until LC comes around, because as we know, sometimes it takes a very, very long time. And of course, LC is now under tremendous pressure from maybe I'll just leave it at that. Y'all know what I mean.
I don't know if this is going to make sense as a question, but I'm curious if the panelists have thoughts on what other levels of governmental power might we be able to connect to make changes. So in the documentary, right, they talked about petitioning congressional folks and talking to them about the work that they were trying to do. Are there other places where we might have some connection or power?
This may be kind of half-baked, but thinking about the recent changes with Gulf of Mexico and Denali, I never realized how much power the Board of Geographic Names has in terms of subject headings and place names, and how the Library of Congress kind of just follows their lead on things like that. So looking to those sources where the Library of Congress is sort of deferring judgment and pressuring them as well is something I'm thinking about recently.
Thank you for that. I think actually, in the interest of making sure we don't get locked in this building, I will just say thank you our final time for all of our panelists and for the audience for joining us. And we'll call it a night.